Just a second here. If you've ever seen me preach before, I don't do well in confined spaces. I want to kind of take you through a little bit of a story this morning, and it's your story. As I describe this, your morning may have been a little bit different than this, but I bet I'm going to be really close on the primary details of most of what you did this morning. You woke up. If you're not a morning person like me, you probably had to use an alarm clock. Some of you may have been awake at 3 o'clock just because you like getting up in the morning. I don't know where people like you come from, but you finally got out of bed, you got dressed, and you got ready for your day. Maybe you put lunch in the oven, or maybe you talked about where you're going to go whenever I quit yakking and let you out of here. You got in your car and you drove here. When you got here, you got out of the car, you came inside. Maybe you were wondering what songs we're going to be singing today. Maybe you were trying to keep track of a little kid that was trying to run away. Maybe you were still thinking about where you're going to go for lunch after I quit yakking and let you out of here. And here we are. I'm guessing probably within a couple of details, that's probably really close to the way most of you spent your morning this morning. I want to go back, and I want to go back through that same story, but I want to change one thing. You woke up. If you're like me, you probably had to use an alarm clock. If you're like me, you laid in bed for a little bit and finally, okay, yeah, I got to get up. So you got out of bed, you got dressed, you got ready for your day. Maybe you put lunch in the oven. Maybe you talked about where you were going to go when we're done today. You got in your car and you drove here. You came up to the stoplight, you stopped, you looked both ways. You're still talking about what you're going to do for lunch. The light changes green and you go. And there's a truck. And you never make it to the other side. The full title of my message this morning is, What If Tomorrow Never Comes? This September has been eerily similar to me to one 13 years ago. In 2001, September 11th was a Tuesday afternoon. Most of you, I don't have to go into detail of what happened that morning. On Thursday, September 13th, we received word that my cousin had been killed in a car accident. I was scheduled to preach here at this church down on that end of the building on the last Sunday of September. I spoke on the story of Lazarus' resurrection. My message was, if only. Mary and Martha talked to Jesus when he finally shows up of, if only you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. My brother would still be alive. And out of that, I was brought to the reminder that God does care. God does cry with us. God hurts with us. Jump forward to this current September. September 9th was a Tuesday. I got word that a friend that I had grown up with was killed in an accident working a construction job. Thursday was September 11th. I went down to the G.R. Ford Museum at the traveling museum that they had there and kind of relived some of those memories. Friday was the funeral for my friend. As the pastor spoke, he referenced Lazarus and the resurrection story of Lazarus, and if only you had been here. And here I am preaching on the last Sunday of the month. that brought me to this kind of realization that I've been sort of working through in my head for some time now, but it kind of all became crystal clear as I was thinking about all of this. And just like, well, actually not just like, but 13 years ago, the last Sunday of the month, I already had figured out what I was planning to preach, but my message changed based on the events that happened that second week in the month. This particular time, I hadn't figured out yet what I was going to preach about this morning. But my message comes out of what happened the second week of the month. I was reminded of that morning. You may have seen the video, the very first video that came out of the entire event that happened that morning, were 3 or 4 firefighters working on something down in the street. I don't know if they were cleaning out a hydrant or exactly what they were doing, but they were working down on the street, and there was a documentary filmmaker there making a film about the New York Fire Department. And he had his camera trained on these guys as they're doing their everyday job. They had gotten up this morning, they had gone to work, and they're doing their job like they do every other morning. And as the cameraman is filming them, you can hear the noise coming out of the distance. And the camera turns and they see that first plane hit the building. I don't know, and I was going to look it up, and I ended up not remembering to do this. I don't know, but I would venture to guess, based on the proximity of where those guys were as they were doing their work, they were probably some of the first people at the building. As the first people at the building, they very likely didn't make it home that day. They were very likely inside when those towers came down. During my friend's funeral, Kent County has finally joined the 21st century, and we get email pages now whenever we get paged out to a call. So I didn't have my pager on me, but I had my phone. I had it set to vibrate, and as we were sitting there in the funeral, my phone vibrated, and I looked at it. We were getting paged to a priority 1 medical emergency. Priority 1. That really solidified what my message this morning was going to become. As a firefighter, I've seen a lot of those after moments. People that got up, started their day, had their plans, and it never happened. Last fall, there was a guy who was jogging. Went to cross Cascade Road. He picked a bad time to do it. 2 seconds before, he was probably thinking about, maybe he was on his way home, maybe he was going to grab something for dinner. It was about 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the evening. I don't know exactly, but he never finished crossing the street. A week later, there was a lady on Fulton Street up here. She had stopped at the O'Brien's Market there and bought some food, some snacks, that kind of thing. And for some reason tried to cross Fulton Avenue. Right there. Again, it was dark. She was wearing dark clothes. Nobody saw her coming. She didn't make it across the road. Just this past summer, we've probably all heard the story about the gentleman that was driving on, I believe it was Honey Creek Road, hit the bicycle rider and killed him. The bicycle rider was quite well known in the community. Just this past week, that same driver was walking in his neighborhood and was hit by a car and killed. The young girl on her way to play practice at the high school. The young man on his way home from hanging out with friends. The father riding motorcycles with his son. The gentleman who was jogging and had a heart attack. The man whose wife was bringing him home from the hospital and he collapsed in the van. I could keep going with those stories. I went back and counted, and since I've been with Ada Fire Department, I have personally responded to 40 of them. People who got up that morning, had their plans, had their ideas, and went about their day as if every other day. And 1 second they were thinking about their plans, the next second they were gone. As a pastor, I've done a lot of funerals. And the time that I spent in Jackson, I did 8 in a year and a half. Most of them were older people. You could say they saw it coming. But it still came. At one point they were alive. At one point they weren't. See, we're not promised tomorrow. So my question to you is, what if tomorrow never comes? What are your priorities in life? What's important to you? Is there a book you want to read? Is there a trip you want to take with your family, a job or food or adventure you want to try? What's on your bucket list, the things you want to do before you kick the bucket? You may not ever have a chance to do those things after today. But more importantly than those things, what about doing something for God? He tells us to seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, to make it a priority in our lives. What are the things that He's asking you to do or to do more of or to get better at? Prayer, reading your Bible, giving to Him or maybe to other people, sharing the message of Christ, raising, leading, supporting your family. Remember, kids are your responsibility. And that's just a short list, because there's a lot of things that He asks us to do. Philippians chapter 3, Paul goes on and he's talking. He says, I want to know Christ. He has to know the power of His resurrection and participation in His sufferings, becoming like Him in His death. And he keeps talking about this. I want to do this. I want to do this. And then in verse 13 he says, brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it. But one thing I do. Forgetting what's behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. That was Paul's priority, was to do what God had called him to do, which for him was traveling around the world preaching and planting churches. In Matthew chapter 22, the teachers of the law of the Jews who were really not happy with this Jesus fellow. He went against everything that they had taught about who the Messiah was supposed to be. And if he's not the Messiah, well, he's claiming to be the Messiah, so there's really something not right with him. And so they're trying to trick him, and they ask him what the greatest commandment was. There's 10 of them. Which one's the greatest? Trying to kind of trip him up a little bit and make him pick something one over the other. And he went back to a different passage in Exodus, and he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. This is the most important thing, is to love God. Later on he says, all people will know you love me if you obey me. So the most important thing is to seek after God, to love Him, to follow Him, to obey Him, and to let Him lead. The second greatest commandment is to love everybody else the way you love yourself. Now, those of us that have maybe self-esteem issues might have a little trouble loving ourselves, but in all honesty, think about it. If there's something that you really want or really need, because you love yourself, you find a way to take care of that. If something is going to hurt you, if you know that there's something important that you need to know, because you love yourself, you're going to make sure that whatever that is taken care of. How about the rest of the people around you? It's been pointed out that the Great Commission, go into all the world and preach the gospel, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and the ends of the earth, comes out of that. Love God and love your neighbor. And that is our Great Commission. That is the one task that He has given us, is to love God and love the world around us the way He does. So let me ask you this. What if you don't live through the rest of this day? What if you don't have a chance to say or do anything else? What if you don't make it home this afternoon? Will you be in heaven? I got to say, that's probably the most significant question you can ask yourself. What will your legacy here be? What will you leave behind? Will you leave behind a lot of money or a lot of really cool things that you did? Or will you leave behind a legacy of somebody that was seeking after God and sharing his message with those around you? What about your family? Will they know that they were important to you? Will they know what was important to you? Probably even more significant than most of those questions goes right along with the first part of that one. What if your friends and family don't make it home today? Will they be in heaven? Greatest commandment is for you to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And your second greatest commandment is to love them the way he does. We talked at one time when I was preaching through the series on the Apostles' Creed about the verse where Peter writes, always be prepared to give an answer for those who ask you about the hope that you have. Is that something that's in the forefront of your mind? Are you always prepared that when somebody asks what's different about you, that you can say something? It doesn't have to be good. That's the thing. It doesn't have to be good. It just has to be something. They say you make time for what you believe is important and excuses for everything else. Now, I got to admit, I've been getting hit over the head with that one a lot lately. I can stand here and tell you that it's important to do things like pray, read your Bible, disciple other people. I have a hard time doing them. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I struggle. I don't do them well. But I'm constantly trying to get better at it. But here's the thing. I tend to make excuses about why I couldn't. And if I'm making excuses, what am I telling God? Just a real quick aside here. What if tomorrow does come? What if you live for another 5 years? I'll just use that phrase because it's one that I've been used, or that time frame, because it's the phrase that I want to go to next. One of the things that I've heard over and over recently, and actually for quite some time, Bob Beal, I believe, pointed it out in his thing. The next 5 years are going to pass, whether you do anything or not. So assuming you make it through those 5 years, at the end of the 5 years, let me ask you this. Will you have done anything? At all? I have not necessarily always been real happy looking back 5 years and seeing what I've done and what I haven't done. Or will you have at least started something within that 5 years? At least started moving somewhere, doing something? See, for me, I tend to be one of these people that, and I've learned a lot about myself over the last couple of years, especially as I've tried to get Firewalker Ministries going. I tend to be one of these people that if I can't stand here at the beginning and see how it's going to make it to the end, I don't want to even start. I want to have that whole path laid out for me so I can get going and I know exactly what's going to happen and where it's going. And one of the things that I struggled with last year with Firewalker was I had all these big ideas and how I thought things were going to go. And when they didn't happen, suddenly I'm sitting at, okay, now I don't know where I'm going. Now it gets really hard for me to go anywhere at all. Makes it really easy to procrastinate things. You could make the case for the motto of my life being, why do today what you can put off till tomorrow? I'm pretty good at doing that. I find things to do that I can do, that I know I can do. You know, something that's kind of important right now. I can do that. I'll get that done and get it out of the way because I can, instead of thinking about and focusing on the really important things that are going to make a difference in 5 years. What if within that next 5 years, our country falls apart? What if in the next 5 years, we start seeing the same kinds of persecution that they're seeing in places like China for our belief in God, or in Syria? What if tomorrow does come? What if you make it through those 5 years? What will you accomplish in that time? But to go back to where we were, what if you don't make it those 5 years? What if the Bible is right? Paul, writing in 1 Thessalonians, reminds us that the end of times will come like a thief in the night. Jesus at one point talks about, well, if the guy had known that the thief was coming, he'd have been ready for him, and he would have been prepared. But when the thief comes in the night, he does that because you aren't ready. So if the end should come, what if the Bible's right about that? Are you ready? What if the Bible's right that we're not promised tomorrow? James writes, now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and vanishes. The writer in Psalm 39 is praying to the Lord. He says, let me know how fleeting my life is. You have made my days a mere handbreadth. The span of my years is nothing before you. Not sure if it's the same writer, but in Psalm chapter 90, most of them were written by David. You will turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by evening it is dry and withered. In Job, in chapter 14, mortals born of woman are of few days and full of trouble. They spring up like flowers and wither away like fleeting shadows they do not endure. Down to verse 5, a person's days are determined. You have decreed the number of his months and set limits he cannot exceed. What if we're not promised tomorrow? And I'll even throw in a little bit of an element here. What if the Bible's not true? What if evolution is true? It doesn't help my point, but I still want to point out that even if that's the case, you're still not promised tomorrow, because then it all becomes a matter of fate. But what if the Bible is true? That God has set a predetermined time when you will die. And that time will come most of the time without you knowing it. Sometimes we can see it coming from a ways off, but there's a lot of people. I remember one gentleman that I spoke to in Vandercook. His family asked me to come talk with him. And he was literally within days of passing away. And even at that point, he still hadn't made the decision to accept Christ. Now, I asked him why, and without going into the whole story, he was afraid it was going to cost him money. And I had the opportunity to share with him the story of the thief on the cross. That, Jesus didn't ask anything from him. But even knowing it was coming, he still just wasn't quite ready. Now, my last question for you. What if the Bible is right? That Jesus is the only way to get to heaven? There is no other name under heaven given to men by which we may be saved. Wow. What if the Bible's right about that? Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, today is the day of salvation. We get up every morning. We have plans. We know what we're going to do today, or maybe we don't know what we're going to do today, but we still have a sort of an idea of, well, at least I know I'm going to eat breakfast, and then I'll probably have lunch, and I'll do something in between. And we get in our car, and we drive places, and we get around, we walk around different places. What if you never make it through that intersection? What if tomorrow never comes? What are you spending your time, energy, money, and brain power on? If tomorrow doesn't come for you, what will you have? What will you leave? Where will you be? If tomorrow doesn't come for those people that you love, where will they be? Brian asked me if I was going to have a rock video again this morning. I'll be perfectly honest, I actually considered it. White Cross has a song called No Second Chances. I figured that one might be a little bit more than you would want to hear. But the title says it all. YOLO! You only live once. We don't get a second shot at this. There's no second chances. We don't know when that book closes and the last chapter is done. My cousin was in his 30s. My friend was in his 40s. Those two pedestrians that tried to cross the road, 40s or 50s, but not sick or anything. The book closed and they weren't ready for it. But I do know that a couple of them were. We got word later that my cousin had actually written to the Billy Graham Crusade to let them know that he had accepted Christ through one of their programs. And my friend was very much a man of God and a man of the church. And I'm convinced that both of them were ready. I don't know about most of the ones that I've shared with you from my personal experience as a firefighter. I don't know how you're supposed to respond this morning. I don't know what you're supposed to do with this. I know what I took from this. I know what God was teaching me. But ask yourself, what if? What if? Lord, this morning, I just ask that you would work in each of our minds and hearts. Lord, that we would come to an understanding that, well, we can't live in fear of constantly having to live in a bubble because we might die. Lord, that we also do have to be ready. That we do have to recognize that at some point this will end. Lord, I pray that for each person here, I pray that they know you and that you can work in their hearts to seek after you at a deeper, deeper level. But Lord, if there's someone here that maybe has never quite pulled that trigger, has never quite made that decision, Lord, I pray that you would remind them that we're not promised tomorrow. But oh, Jesus, thank you that we can have a promise of tomorrow if we're in you. Because when our time ends here, we can be with you in heaven for eternity. Lord, I pray that that would be a burning desire in our hearts, not only for ourselves, but for those around us. Lord, that we would be constantly aware of the need and constantly aware of those that you are trying to reach through us. Lord, I pray that as we go out from here this morning, that your Spirit would go with us and that we would be reminded to make the important things the important things. Say all these things in the name of